Brought to you by Penguin.
You'll Never See Me Again by Lesley Pearse. Read by Lucy Brownhill. Chapter 1. Hallsands, Devon, 1917. The wind and heavy rain coming right off the sea rattled the cottage windows and pounded on the glass. Betty shuddered. She'd lived in this village her entire life and seen the destruction the sea was capable of, but she'd never felt so menaced by it before.
"If you've got anything about you, you'll get down there and rescue what you can."
Betty almost jumped out of her skin at the sharp order from her mother-in-law. She'd been so engrossed in watching the terrifying sight of huge waves crashing onto the beach far below, looking up to where her own house stood, that she hadn't heard Agnes come into the room. Her mother-in-law's threatening tone was even more disturbing than the scene beyond the window. "But it's almost dark," Betty protested. "It's far too dangerous to go there now."
"So you're happy to lose all your belongings, and my son's, and sponge off me once your house is gone?"
Betty couldn't think of anything worse than being forced to live permanently with Agnes. She was a cold-hearted, mean-spirited shrew of a woman, and the only reason Betty was in her house now was because she'd come to see her husband. Martin had been staying with his mother and grandfather for a month now, since being sent home from France, suffering from a leg wound and shell shock. In truth, there wasn't much point in visiting him. He spent all day hunched in a chair by the fire. The only thing that could rouse him from his stupor was a sudden loud noise. When the door banged, he would dive to the floor, gibbering in terror. "Of course I'm not happy to lose everything. But everyone else in the row has left their homes to find shelter somewhere else for the night. They say tonight's high tide will sweep the whole street and all the houses away."
"Quite so. But you've got a few hours yet. Stop being so feeble and get down there."
Betty glanced anxiously at the scene beyond the window. The sky was like lead, the sea the same colour. But as the huge waves uncurled to show peaks of pure white, they reminded her of a savage dog's teeth. As she was the daughter of a fisherman who had lost his life at sea, she knew better than anyone how cruel it could be. When she looked back at Agnes, she saw she had picked up a lump of bread dough and was kneading it on the table. She was attacking it with such force, her knuckles were white, and Betty could imagine one of those large, rough fists slamming into her face if she didn't obey her. "I'm not sure I can even get down the lane," Betty said fearfully. She had experienced enough rough weather in her life to know that when the path was wet and strewn with shingle, it was treacherous. She suspected that the strength of the wind could send a wave high enough to snatch her up and toss her into the sea.
"Rubbish! Don't be so pathetic!"
Agnes snarled at her.
"You've always been spineless. I don't know what my son ever saw in you."
Betty went over to her husband, putting her hand on his shoulder. But she knew she could expect no help and support from him. He wasn't even aware of his wife's presence, let alone that his mother was nasty to her. His physical wounds might have healed, but it seemed the mental ones would remain forever. Many people viewed his problem as a ruse to escape being sent back to the front. But Betty knew what ailed him was as real as the wild sea outside. God only knew what horrors he'd been subjected to in France, but they were vicious enough to rob him of his strength, his health, even knowing what it meant to be a husband. "Why are you always so hateful to me?" Betty asked Agnes. She knew she was pushing her luck asking such a thing. The woman was as quick to slap as she was to humiliate. "I've never done anything to you." Agnes's lip curled back.
"You're so mealy-mouthed. You think you're better than anyone else, especially since you got that new job."
Betty took her cloak down from the peg by the door. She had been lucky to get the housekeeping job in Kingsbridge. A girl of 22, whose only real skill was helping her father to fish, wouldn't expect to get such a position.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?